Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Skills Development Summit. We are on day one. Please don't forget to add your comments, recommendations, or any point that you want us to engage on at hashtag Skills Summit 22. That is hashtag Skills Summit 22. And don't forget that we will be announcing our prizes today, or rather our winners today, with people that engaged very much on our online platforms. We have our last panel of the day, which for me really hits home because it's affecting, a lot of countries. It's affecting a lot of policy-oriented frameworks. We are talking transitioning from secondary school to tertiary education. And with me this afternoon, I have Mr. Ntato Silebi, who's a project director under the unit National Projects at SAICA. We also have Mr. Russell Davies, who is the director at Rural Education Access Program. We have Professor Heather Neal, who is the senior director at institutional strategy for Nelson Mandela University. We also have Suzanne Ramul, who is mentoring and student support manager at Study Trust. We have Miss Melody Clava, who's co-founder and chief creative director at My Future Work. And last but not least, we have Mr. Olelo Brian Pike, accounting and executive officer and principal in college sector. Welcome to every one of you, and thank you very much for joining us. In that order, maybe let's start with Mr. Silebi, introduction as well as the institution in representation.
Good afternoon, Tawan, and good afternoon, colleagues. Ntato Silebi is my name. I am a project director at the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants. My primary responsibilities are to oversee national projects that we run, particularly with learners seeking to qualify as chartered accountants or to join the accountancy profession. We literally work with them from school level all the way until they qualify. But focus is primarily between those that are in grade 10 and those that then enter university. Thank you very much, Tabang.
Thank you there. Can we please have Mr. Davies?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Russell Davies. I'm the director of REAP, that's the Rural Education Access Program. We are a South African NPO linked to the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference, been running for about 20 years. And our main focus is assisting young people from low-income families in rural areas to access and succeed in post-school education and training opportunities, which includes university, but also technical and vocational skills training. We operate all over South Africa. We work with several universities, also a few TVET colleges, and we work in some rural secondary schools, helping to prepare learners for tertiary studies. And I guess when we consider the topic today about transitioning, I think there's two elements. One is actually making it from school into tertiary, the process of making that, I guess it's about access. And then secondly, how they manage, how they cope when they actually have arrived. So I hope today we'll have a chance to talk about both those dimensions.
Thank you very much. We certainly will, Mr. Davies. Can I please have Professor Neal?
Good afternoon, everyone, and it's lovely to be with you this afternoon. My name is Heather Neal, and I am the Senior Director for Institutional Strategy at Nelson Mandela University. We are based in Pretoria in the Eastern Cape, and we boast a fairly sizable undergraduate population of students, and my responsibility relates to partly to what we call enrollment planning, which governs the number of students that the university can accept to widen access while also promoting student success. So that's our primary focus. We're a comprehensive university, and we pride ourselves on promoting access, but doing so responsibly so that we set students up to be successful, not only as students in their academics, but as graduates ultimately in the world of work. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Professor Neal. Lovely to have you. Susan.
Hi, good afternoon, Tabang, and everyone who's in the room today. So my name is Suzanne Ramul, and I think before I get into telling you guys a bit about what I do, I'd like to just tell you a bit about myself as well. So I was born and raised in a very small village in Limpopo Venda called Mpura. I doubt any of the panelists know where that is. And I'm one of the students who were expected or had to transition from a small village to a big city. I started in UCT at a very young age, having started my first year at the age of 16, having completed my matric just at the age of 15. So I feel like I completely understand the challenges faced by students as I've had to live it. So basically, I did my undergrad in psychology, then did my honors in gender studies at UCT, and currently I am doing my master's, completing my master's in critical diversity studies at BETS. And after completing my studies, I joined Studies First, which is a bursary organization. We do bursary administration, and we also provide mentoring and student support to students. So for the past 5 years of my career, I've been involved in providing mentorship, student support, and also just in the formulation and the implementation of the different programs that students need for them to be able to succeed. Already Heather and Russell have already spoken a bit about access and success, right? So we're very much, basically my day-to-day job includes me helping students on a daily basis to make sure that they are succeeding in university. And as an organization, we have conducted a lot of research when it comes to generally student experiences. And one of the things or challenges that we have realized that our students face when they get to university, it has to do mostly with things like adjusting to university, adjusting to the intellectual pressure. We call it intellectual pressure, which basically means coping with the workload. You already know the story. The workload is too much. The pace is too fast. I cannot pick up. Having to adapt to certain learning and teaching methodology. I have to change my study methods and all of that. Resilience, struggle with alienation, which I feel like has really increased in the past 2 years because of the pandemic, right? But one of the things or topics that I want us to talk about today is basically the adjustment to a new environment. I feel like in most cases, we do speak a lot about academic challenges, but we hardly speak much about the challenges that comes with moving from one small place to another. And the reason why I speak about this is that, as I've already mentioned, I grew up in a very small village. And for the first time in my life, when I got to university, for the first time, my identity was visible. I started not only looking at myself as just Susan, but Susan, a young Black female in a very foreign city who, for the first time in her life, is looking around and seeing people who don't look like her. And in most cases, what that does is that it affects how I navigate my identity, how you make sense of yourself in that foreign environment. And that in turn can then affect how you make sense of yourself and your capabilities as well, which can impact your academic performance as well. So if there's two things that I want to talk about today is adjusting to new environment, specifically speaking to navigating identities and how that in turn can lead to alienation and how that can then impact a student academic performance. So thank you so much, Taban.
Thank you very much there, Susan. Truly appreciated. Melody, Clava.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Melody Clava. A little bit about myself. I run a e-learning agency called My Future Work. And what we do is we help institutions of higher education as well as companies transition, move their training from face-to-face to online training. A big part of what we do and some of our biggest projects is working and designing e-learning for learnership students. And as you know that, learnerships in this country are targeted at, students who are mostly predominantly come from lower income households, and some of them, are from rural areas. And part of as well of why we've had to do this work with learnerships was COVID, right? Because COVID hit and you know, some of the learnerships stopped, but you know, we had to find a way, institutions had to find a way to carry on. And this is where, you know, we come in and we design multimedia solutions for e-learning, and in a way that it can work and it can accommodate children who come from lower income households. And we're very passionate about, you know, coming up with solutions that are able to just bring us closer to bridging the digital divide. And in our solutions, one of the important things is data consumption, right? When you talk e-learning, you're talking about how are kids, you know, consuming content, what device are they using, how much data are they going to use? And this is all important as well, because a lot of the students who are in learnerships are first generation students who are going from high school and moving to a tertiary education. And this for me as well is a topic that's very personal, in the sense that I'm a first generation, like I was the first child in my family to go to university, and to actually even double that, I went to a private university because of what I wanted to study. Got a bursary, went into a private university, big excitement about me going to university, nothing in it for just how hectic that first year was going to be. And being the extrovert that I am, I also did not expect that I would struggle. So I'm an extrovert, I've got a large personality, I've been fairly confident all my life, I do very well academically, and here I am, first year, private university, 8 months into it, really feeling like I'm going to drop out, because I could not cope. I was struggling to adjust, not with academics. The academics was fine. Academics is actually why I ended up staying at university, because when I did go to student council to deregister and say, I'm dropping out, I can't do this anymore. And they said, but you're an A student, you're doing so well. And the part that everybody else around me could not understand was how I was just not coping with the cultural adjustment. I was not coping with the environment. Just the economic divide was so big. I was just struggling, you know, with all of that. And so for me, echoing, you know, what Suzanne was saying, that's an important part of the discussion today, to say academics are one thing, right? And they are very important. We understand that it's important that we prepare students to be able to transition from secondary to tertiary when it comes to that element, but there's also our socioeconomic factors where a majority of our students are first generation university students, and that has a huge impact into how they transition. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. That was Melody Clava. We just struggled here and there to hear you. Please just check your network just a little bit. But so far, thank you. We did get just the synopsis of what you were saying. Mr. Pike, can we have you here?
So thank you, Tabang. Let me just correct. I am Pike and not a Fike or Pike. Pike.
Okay.
PH and with the Pike. Thank you so much for having invited me to be part of this discussion. And I'm not very sure what qualified me to be invited, but a little bit of a background from where I come from. I worked at both university and TVET colleges. I was also in the school environment, left as a school principal, and I worked at the university as a residence administrator and warden for first year students in particular. And currently I'm heading a TVET college in the Western Cape. My engagement are more of a strategic leadership, governance support, and also giving inputs into policy development. And my key performance area amongst many is in line with the performance of the institution in terms of access, success, and retention. And throughout those experiences, one then gets to pick up the challenges that your students are facing. So a college environment ideally is offering 3 different qualifications: the National Certificate Vocational, the Report 1N1, and occupational programs. And as a result, we attract students from the age of 14 up until 100, if they do leave up until 100. You then understand the spectrum of students that we are attracting and the issues that arise as a result of that spectrum. And we have, over the years, understood that students, the integration into the system is most probably twofold. Is how do they succeed in terms of the academic system? Then secondly, how do they succeed in terms of the psychosocial system that the challenges put to them? And to retain that spectrum comes with its own challenges. And I'm particularly excited to be part of this discussion so that as a sector, we are then able to also have an influence in terms of how we are going to have this learning journey in the life of a TVET college student being successful. Remember that we are being measured on how well we retain the students over and above how well they are doing academically, and also what measures do we put in place to deal with the barriers in terms of having them access to the institution. So I think the discussion today will certainly have an impact on many of the areas that we are supposed to be intervening with as a college in South. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Piquet. Truly appreciate it. You've actually mentioned one or 2 points that we can engage with on this particular panel discussion. Maybe let me go back to Mr. Davies, and then I'll come to you, Nthato. Mr. Davies, you'd mentioned a couple of challenges with transitioning. In your organization, what have you noted those challenges to be?
Well, multiple challenges. So firstly, in terms of the question of access. So, you know, as an organization, we don't have a lot of influence over the kind of marks that learners obtain, which, you know, qualifies them or not to get into the various courses.
Right.
But what we have discovered is that even learners who attain the marks necessary to get into some kind of post-school education and training opportunity don't actually make that transition for various reasons. One is around lack of career guidance, that from an early stage, they don't have a sense of what the various options available to them are. And they sometimes make choices from a very limited range of options based on often misconceptions. And we've sometimes found with our sort of first-year students that they get 3-6 months into their studies and discover that this is really not for me. It's not what I thought I was signing up for. It really doesn't suit me. So one is a lack of career guidance. I think another is a lack of role models. They don't come from households where there's, you know, it's a reading culture where, you know, going into further studies is what we do in our family. So they don't know anybody who's ever done that. And often working in rural areas, they're in communities with very low aspiration where people don't expect to go on. They don't have this expectation of future dreams of where to go. So they're not coming from an environment that encourages them to go further. And then I think another very practical issue is lack of access to IT, and they're coming from schools without functioning computer labs, very poor connectivity, and yet the whole process often of gathering the necessary information and navigating their way through the application process is very IT focused. And so they can't actually, you know, manage that transition. So they don't know what to study. They have very poor information. They don't know very practical things like which institutions offer these courses, what kind of marks you need to get into those courses, what's the cutoff date for applying. And then they also don't know what their funding options are. So they think they can't afford to do this course. You'd be amazed how many people in the rural areas especially don't know about NSFAS. They say, I couldn't study for financial reasons. And you ask the question, well, why didn't you apply for NSFAS? Oh, didn't realize I could. Or I missed the cutoff date for NSFAS. So a lot of what we do at REAP is about trying to, I guess, pick low-hanging fruit. So identifying learners who actually would qualify, but just need some proper career guidance. So we do psychometric testing, we do very detailed career guidance and give people feedback as to the various courses that they could do that match their personality, their skill sets, their marks so far. And then, give very practical information like, okay, if you're interested in this, here's the various institutions that offer these courses. These are the marks you need to get to do that, to get in. Here's the cutoff dates. Here's how you apply for NSFAS. And then we do very basic IT skills training so that at least they can start to navigate their way through that process. So there's some of the practical things of even just getting in the first place. And as I said, I'm not talking about just getting good enough marks at school. We don't have a lot of influence on that. There's a whole 3-week seminar on the ills of the education system in getting people to that academic level necessary. But I'm talking about people who would be there but don't make the transition for lack of career guidance and the practicalities of knowing how to apply both to the relevant institutions and to get funding on time. And so we actually hold their hand through that whole process of applying to the institutions at the right time to make sure they even get there. The other thing I would say is the lack of IT exposure and skills really hurts them, particularly in a COVID context where so much learning is IT focused. You can imagine what's it like if you've come from a rural area, you arrive at university, you don't even get to meet your lecturers, you're studying at home in an environment with 8 people living in the house, noisy, dark, cramped, electricity coming on and off, load shedding, poor connectivity, and you've had no exposure to IT. How are you supposed to succeed in that context? It's a hell of a thing. And so that's, I think, aside from the usual transition issues around, rural to urban, school to university, a whole different way of learning, coming from a very monocultural, monolingual rural environment to a very diverse setting can be very overwhelming. There's the whole hero to zero syndrome, where if you've done well enough at a rural school to get into university, you're one of the stars. You get to university, you're almost anonymous. It's large, it's almost overwhelming. Learning to live independently when you've always lived at home, you've never had to cook or budget or shop or never had to manage money. It's a whole transition apart from the whole different learning style. So yeah, I've given you a shopping list of issues there.
Absolutely shocking. Thank you so much, Davies.
A shopping list, I said, but it's also a shocking list.
Shopping, sorry. With the audios, we hear different things and we say different things. So apologies around that. Yeah. It certainly is a shopping list.
So I think my point was the whole issue of even getting in, if I'm eligible because of the marks I've attained, there's a bunch of barriers there. And then once I get there, there's a whole load of transitionary issues, which are, Susan and Melody have experienced firsthand some of those and will be, able to speak more about that. But certainly
on how they dealt with that.
That's a lot of what we try to address with the support we give to our learners when they arrive.
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Davies. And Tato, maybe you can come in here. What support has SAICA offered to, students that want to pursue, accounting or being a CA? We know that there's usually with all these faculties, there's a lot of high pressure, particularly I've seen personally with the accounting sector or finance degree. It's very competitive, it's very rigorous. But what is SAICA doing to support students in that regard and to get them within the system as well?
Thank you, Thabang. Before I address the question, just allow me to add maybe one more thing to what Mr. Davies said around what we've picked up over the last couple of years as one of the challenges. Although we've noted before, but we're seeing it at a much higher level, I think, since the pandemic. It's the fact that the family isn't necessarily transitioning with the learner to university. And that we're finding that is something that we are seriously having to address because particularly the hybrid learning model that universities had adopted in order to be able to keep pace have now necessitated for the learner by, in many circumstances to be at home, as Mr. Davies has explained. And now the timing, the scheduling, all of that becomes disruptive to the family. And in that space, recipe for conflict. And while at the same time, the family is very hopeful and looks to this young person to be the bright star and the one that takes the family out of whatever situation they are in into a better situation. We're finding that families aren't necessarily prepared to deal with those challenges and transitioning. To your question around how sorry, Mr. Davis?
So I was just going to add there, we've found with our learners, they're also dragged back into the family drama when they go home. They're studying at home and they're called upon to do all the chores, and their allowances are being diverted into feeding the rest of the family. It's a whole it's a whole other thing. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. No problem. I think for us as SAICA, one of the things that we noticed, Thabang, I'm dating myself now, which is not a good thing. 20 years ago was the fact that we needed to put a support system in place that would assist the learners be able to make the transition, but also to not then be a burden on the family. And it was then being able to provide what we regarded as more of a holistic kind of support, psychosocial support, economic support, academic support, and in many ways also to try and assist the student begin to not necessarily be dependent on this support that we were providing, but being able to learn and skills and be able to acquire coping mechanisms where then as they transition from first year to second year, they become a bit more independent, so that when they do reach fourth year at CTA, they are a lot more independent from being able to not being able to manage their finances when they get to varsity, to being able to plan for the next year as a trainee in terms of what my first month's rent will be, et cetera, et cetera. So the Tutuka program was designed specifically to make sure that students who particularly come as first generation students to university, who come from environments where there are no role models, where they are, by and large, the first ones to experience this, are given as much support as possible. As I said, the pandemic has thrown a spanner in the works, where we are now realizing we have to also now start taking the family along in many ways to try and assist in that transition.
Thank you so much for that. Perhaps Professor Neal, you can come in there. Mr. Brian had mentioned, the challenges not only from an academic perspective, but also psychosocial. As a professor working for a renowned institution, what have you experienced between the academic and psychosocial challenges that students are confronted with?
Thanks so much, Thabang. Yes, it is a real challenge. And I think, a university environment can be very alienating. So I think it was Russell was talking about the feeling of being anonymous. You're almost reduced to a student number, and your lecturers don't necessarily even know your name, let alone where you come from and what kinds of barriers you've overcome to get there. So I think, at the heart of what we are all saying is the need for empathy and a real caring, because it's one thing to stand in front of a class, whether it's online or in person, and teach and engage with students around, your learning outcomes. But it's an entirely different thing to actually get to know your students and to understand where they come from, to understand what they're experiencing. And what we speak of at our university, I mean, it's a lot of fancy words, but we speak of a humanizing educational approach. So we try to understand the person who the student is, and we try to avoid a deficit way of thinking about the student. So many lecturers will complain about students being underprepared, students not ready for higher education, students needing to be bridged, and a lot of effort that goes into that bridging. But what we try to do is rather perceive it or approach it from a humanizing perspective, where we look at that young person or older person, for that matter, if it's lifelong learning, and understand who they are in terms of their potential, their talent, their hopes, their aspirations, and to work from that point and really just nurture and try our best, even in large classes, to try and get to know what are the students dealing with, and how can the university assist them along their journey through their studies from first year to graduation, and really just provide holistic support. So not just academic support, but holistic support. And I think one of the big challenges is students often don't know what support is available to them.
Yes.
So that's another barrier, is just communicating as broadly as possible what's available, and encouraging students to take up those opportunities, because many see it as a stigma if they have to approach student counseling, for example, if they're struggling. But it's absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. It's something that, as we've already heard from this panel, the best students academically are often the ones that suffer the most, because there's such expectation placed on their shoulders. And they often struggle under the burden of that expectation to perform. So yes, absolutely, the balance between seeing the student in terms of their academics, but also seeing the student as a person with psychosocial needs is really critical. Thanks, Taban.
Sure. Thank you very much, Professor Neal. Susan, you can come in there, and then I'll go to Melody. I mean, we've.
Can I just add something to what Professor?
Okay.
Would that be fine with you?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
So maybe if I can just put a spanner into the wheel.
Sure.
The institution that I'm currently at is attracting about 75% of its students from other provinces, and not students within the province. And that's challenge number one. And they come with all sorts of baggage, and I think it has been well said here. But then also we're attracting a student who otherwise would not have found him or herself in any higher education institution. And that due to various reasons, being rejected by universities, being dropouts from schools, being delinquent and the like. Our minister actually has a very nice word that he normally says to us, that there is no dumping site for a South African youth. And we need to deal with that as TVET colleges. But then the third thing that is also critical is the misconception that is out there about TVET colleges dealing with what we used to call handwork. And in fact, TVET colleges are extremely heavy on theoretical aspects of their teaching. But then what becomes a challenge, maybe just for the panel's sake, we are running programs that are 8 weeks, 4 months, and 8 months in length. I'm talking about the formal academic qualifications. And I'm not talking about the skills programs that we are running for a number. Now that puts tremendous pressure on a student to speedily adapt to the different and various strange sometimes academic and social environment. And as a result, what we have done as a TVET college is we have an entry level assessment, which does not determine whether you are accepted or not, but is identifying skills gaps or academic gaps so that the institution can then develop focused interventions. But then also we have appointed counselors and academic support officers in each of our 7 campuses so that they are there on a daily basis and intervene in those students. So we are dealing with a lot of pre-entry counseling support. We have on-course support and counseling consistently right through the academic life of the student. And then we have post-academic life support, which we call post support. So the student comes in before he or she gets into the system, has been engaged with one way or another with what the institution is offering and should be offering. And whilst they are here and as they are exiting, they still get that support until they sometimes finish their qualification. But I must say it is extremely one-time consuming, and of course the human resources becomes a challenge for us to consistently deal with this, because you then sit with a counselor that sometimes is one counselor versus 3,000 students in one of the campuses. And that just becomes enormous. So many times we also then do referrals to the outside organizations that we have partnerships with. But the challenge still remains that we do have our students not fully attended to as we would have loved to. And I just felt, let me just add that to the debate as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pike. Maybe you can come in there, Susan, just based on some of the barriers that have been mentioned and some of the barriers that you overcame. How have you integrated that into the study trust as a mentor and as a student support manager?
Thank you so much, Thabang. So I would say that for me, what assisted me with the adjustment to university was what I will add on to what Heather was speaking about, the interventions that universities have in place. So I was part of what they call the EDU at UCT, which is an extended degree unit, right? And they provide extra support to students coming from specific or certain disadvantaged backgrounds. And that means that you attend extra tutorials. And one of the things that I struggled the most for me with when I was adjusting was just speaking up in class. So moving from where I'm coming from, coming into this big room, you know, and funny enough, I actually attended a private school. So I was used to being one of the 10 learners in class. And all of a sudden I go to UCT and there's 100 learners in class. And I think we've spoken about this. You are the special kid in your small community. You go to this large community and you realize that actually you are nobody knows your name. You are anonymous. They don't know how special you are. And one of the things that I did, which went really great, was that I didn't really participate fully with the community, the university community, right? And that meant that coming into class, I'll be the kid sitting at the back because I don't want the lecturer to pick on me, because I don't think I'll be able to articulate my thought. Not because I don't know what to say, but because I don't believe that I can say it. I actually believe that the person sitting next to me who's different from what I am can probably articulate it better. Maybe they have something smarter to say. And what the EDU assisted me with was that we also had our own small lecture or tutorials after that. So you attend your main class, and then after that, you still attend your extra tutorial. So I find those things were very helpful in terms of the institutional support. We had peer mentors from the university, peer mentor from campus. But I think one thing that we also need to note is that not every single student becomes or they get to be a part of the EDU. Most of the top achievers, when they come in, they feel that, okay, academically they are capable, go to mainstream, and that's when they suffer the most. So I would say in terms of institution, that was great. But what I would say I brought into what my experience helped me in terms of what to add in terms of study trust as the mentoring and student support manager is this space of building a community. That place where you can feel like you belong, because that's what I spoke about, that the minute you feel like you don't belong in a community, you can't fully participate in it. And we all know when it comes to university, you need to be fully in it, 100% in it. Otherwise, if you're not fully participating with your lecturers, with your tutorials, with your extra activity, you feel alienated and you start feeling like, oh my God, I really can't do this. And just to give an example, last year we had a student from Limpopo who was studying actual science at UCT, first year, top achiever, one of the top learners at Limpopo for the whole province. But what he struggled with was the same thing, language, closing himself in his room, felt like he couldn't make friends. That meant that he couldn't engage with all the other activities. And what happened at the end of the year was that he failed. And within the space that we work in is that in most cases, funders don't want to fund an additional year. Why should I pay another 150,000 for you to continue studying where else, you know, you didn't succeed in first year? So what we try to do is to avoid that by creating a community of belonging. So before our students even come in or they start with university, we have what we call our summer camp. Before it was very nice. We would go to a particular space and all network with each other. And we cover different topics. Most of the stuff I think Russell has already covered, has already spoken about. From finances, we cover topics like diversity. We have networking activities where we speed date with each other, just to equip you with those relationship making skills that you will need when you get to university. So I think my experience made me realize the importance of community building. And also we also have what we call the peer mentoring program. So basically we match all our first year students to mentors. And what we try to do in most cases is try to allocate them to somebody who's probably studying the same study program that they're in, somebody who looks like them, somebody who probably has an understanding of some of the challenges that they're gonna face when they come in, so that already when they look at that person, when they're in first year, they see them in third year, they're like, oh my God, somebody has done it, I can do it too. So that's another way in which we encourage that community. And also the workshops that we have, so we try to have institutional workshops. So generally, instead of just combining all our students into one, we will go out to UCT, let's network with each other, meet other students who are in the same university as you are, so that there's that UCT or UJ study trust community that you feel like
fantastic.
You are part of. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Susan. Melody, maybe come in here. You spoke about creating multimedia solutions for e-learning, and that was with respect to data consumption and so forth. We have a question from Isaac here saying, how can townships and rural areas have access to critical information? So it could be with respect to registration, finding information about universities, etc., etc.
Well, I mean, so now you're talking in regards to online, right?
Yes, of course, in the context of, I mean, that's access, right?
So how do they get, access to information with regards to online platforms? Yes. Well, I mean, with the different institutions, they usually have like a portal where you can go and be able to access information. And there's been lots of developments since COVID in that regard, where, students can go and be able to access, information online. But one of the things that we still, need to really further develop is the data part of it, right? A lot of these websites, you find that they consume a lot of data. So yes, the information is there, but the students are unable to access it because they don't have the data. And one of the big things really that's being advocated for when it comes to the different telecoms is to be able to zero the data consumption when it comes to the networks and the websites of the universities. It's still a fight, that's still ongoing, that, we are hoping that, at some point soon we'll be able to win that, because that's going to make things easier in terms of then students being able to have access to the information online, because data is, a major issue. And then another different level as well when it comes to access, when it comes to online learning, is now you've gone and you've registered, right? And now you've registered, you've managed to make it work. Studying online consumes a lot of data.
Yes.
Accessing the videos, accessing, all the multimedia content, consumes a lot of data. So again, we are in a space, I guess, in a process of just working on solutions as to a lot of what we do with e-learning and multimedia obviously is borrowed from international solutions. A lot of things start overseas. They start in America, they start in the UK. We see this is a lovely solution. We bring it to the country, and then we realize that that's actually not going to work very well here, right? Because, we have different challenges. And a big part of the work that we do as well is looking at those solutions and going, how do we make our material small enough? It's really our biggest innovation in our company goes into that. And our biggest research and our biggest investment in research is, when we've made this product, the important thing that we have to look at is how big is it? How much data is it going to consume? Because that is the difference between a person being able to study and not being able to study. Really that simple. They may have all the desire, in the world to study, but if they can't access it, if this thing is 100 megabytes, that's it for them, it's over, right? So how do we then make it small enough to go, when you've received your data allowance, this is 10 megabytes, so it means that you can access 10 of these and you're able to, to get through all your courses for the week. So that's part of the problems and that we encounter, and the solutions that, we are looking at. And one of them as well is looking at WhatsApp. And we're still, working on the solution as well. WhatsApp, has taken on in Africa, like more than any other continent, right? Even in South Africa, we are amongst the largest WhatsApp population as well, you know, in the world. And we're also working on solutions as to WhatsApp is already in your pocket, right? It's already an app on your phone and it's already in your pocket. How do we then start to bring e-learning solutions onto WhatsApp that don't require you to be able to go and log on to another platform, you know, use something else that consumes a lot of data, adjusting to a new system that you've never seen. So those are just some of the solutions as well that we are looking at and working on from an e-learning and an online perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. PK, maybe you can come in here. I see you've added in the chat room. Maybe you can just tell us a bit about the comment that you've mentioned there. Okay, you're still on mute. There we go.
Thank you very much. I think I must get this Clava to also help me.
Technology.
As I indicated earlier on, we are faced with students from age of 15 who are now immediately faced with a challenge because they are coming from provinces outside of the Western Cape, who must now immediately take ownership of their lives. There's no parent, there's no big brother that is around them. They are now on their own. And at that age needs to then start to become self-sustained person who must stand up, build their own self-confidence, most probably stand up against the environmental issues that he or she might find in the institution. But then they also must take ownership of their studies. It is no more in an environment within which mommy, daddy, or any other person is there to say, you must now read. They are given an assignment and the due date is there. Yes, we make available resources like our open learning centers, where they will have access to computers, access to the internet, access to Wi-Fi, and be able to do their work. But still, they need to then step up and become the person that is going to take a decision on whether they want to succeed in this environment or not. And those are the pressures that these students finding themselves in. And sitting next to an elderly person who is most probably psychologically much more matured than a 15-year-old, and that person might get the grades because they understand the curriculum from an adult perspective. It's putting a lot of pressure on our young ones to be able to perform. I think somebody mentioned earlier on that they would close themselves in a room because they cannot face this booty or this sissy who's sitting next to them, who should be their mother or their father by right, in the same environment. So those are the pressures that we are doing. And as a college, we, as I said earlier on, we then have counselors, but getting a student from the room into a counseling center or to confront a counselor is always also very foreign, especially in our African culture. We grew up in environments where you don't know a counselor, you don't know a psychologist, and so on. And now having to expose yourself and speak to a person who is a stranger also becomes a very difficult one. And hence my comment. But as I said, we do have those kinds of services on our various campuses, individualized in some instances. And of course, our lecturers are also trained to deal with some of the psychosocial issues that students are facing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just very quickly there, Mr. Davies, you mentioned the importance of striking a balance, between support and veering and so forth. How do you advise that we can promote agency and independence, particularly with respect to transitioning?
Look, it's a very tough one, and
Sure.
I think REAP has tended to err on the side of offering a lot of support, and I'm sometimes challenged by some of my colleagues, Susan's boss Murray and others who will say, are REAP mothering, nannying our students? Do we pay enough attention to their strengths? How intensive must the support model be? What's the right blend of trusting them as adults to and recognizing their strengths, that they're coming from rural areas, but which is the case for our students. But to even get to university, they've had to overcome so many challenges. They bring all these qualities that are quite exceptional. So Yeah, it's a challenging one, yet we know they face a lot of challenges. So they do need support. There's no magic answer for it. And I also chair a network of organisations who work in this sector, the National Bursary Support Providers Forum, and we have debates within that quite often about what level of support is appropriate and at what stage are you almost not doing your students a favour by over-mothering them or whatever the term might be. So that's something. Can I also just pick on another point, Tabang, that I think Brian touches on, and it really speaks to this issue of transition, and it's about, I guess it comes from a lack of career guidance, but what we find is that it's very hard sometimes to get learners to want to go to a TVET college and they would rather go to university. And yet many of them are really not suited to be in a university, and they go there and they fail, and it's seen as a very inferior choice. And TVET colleges have a very low sort of reputation. And to be frank, even with donors, it's hard to get donors to want to fund. We find we work in some rural areas and you have a small number of donors, various donors, perhaps mines, etc., who have bursary funds fighting over a very small number of learners who qualify to go to university. They all want to fund them. But then the great majority of learners who are much better suited being in a vocational training stream can't get anyone to support them. And we know that the NSFAS allowances at TVET are inferior to the NSFAS allowances at university, which is bizarre. Certainly TVET students don't eat less than university students or need any less of a bed to stay in, yet the allowances are significantly lower, but you can't get corporates to want to fund it. And so this whole system encourages people going into university who are really not best suited to be there. And as Brian says, they arrive at TVET and it's like that's the consolation prize, or even worse. It's not something they picked or wanted, somewhere where they wanted to be. Yet, actually, we know that vocational skills training is critical for this country. And we know that some other countries in the world, Germany being a great example, really value this kind of education and invest money in it and do it well. Yet in our country, it's very much the poor relation, both for students, for funders, and for government. And I think it's one of the untold tragedies of our country, and speaks to why we have so much unemployment. And just to go further, I think what's often not recognised is that the whole fees must fall movement was largely driven by the missing middle, not by the poor. The poor always had access to universities through NSFAS. The missing middle were the people who were driving this at the expensive institutions like WITS and UCT. It got publicity. And then the government, to fund free higher education, had to raid the TVET till. And so, money that was earmarked for TVET got diverted. And so, we have this elitist system where all the money goes to the top 5% of learners who qualify for university, yet the great majority who would be much better in TVET can't get money for it. So that's my little rant in terms of transition. I think part of the transition issues, you've got people at university who really should not be there, who would be better in other learning institutions.
And it would be so great to have a system or a network that is able to be honest with students, to say, based on a psychometric test, for example, or based on a talent manager's consult, you're better suited for this career. But once again, a lot of this is tied to culture. A lot of this is tied to perception, social perception. And I think maybe because we're running out of time, maybe Melody, at a later stage, you can comment, how do we really set boundaries between, especially with social media and the digital space, because we find that is also the source of pressure that we see, not only social pressure, but academic pressure and so forth. It's a great tool for us to advance and so forth. But I'd like Professor Neal, please can you just come in here? We will be closing in the next 10 minutes, and we'll then ask all of you to please prepare your closing remarks. But Professor Neal, do you think lecturers have an obligation to support students beyond the classroom, or rather in the classroom, in terms of the methods of teaching? For example, you will find in a class, the lecturer will say, listen here, this is not nursery school. I'm not here to babysit you. Get your act together. It's very cutthroat. There are sometimes, the methodologies are different. And you find that in a class, you have people who might be slow learners, who might process things differently. Do you think lecturers have an obligation to offer support in that regard?
Absolutely, yes. So, Tabang, what we do at our university is we monitor student success very carefully. And we through various forms of information, including data, and also actually just surveying students and lecturers themselves, identify barriers to student success. And then we have what we call a tracking system, which is leaning on data to identify very early on students who are at risk and vulnerable academically in terms of success, so that the lecturers can identify those students and intervene quickly. Because we heard, I think, from Susan about a really talented student who got to the end of first year and failed because of various barriers, beyond his control and not related to academic performance. And the importance of picking that up quickly and early identification and early intervention is really critical. So what we do is we have what's called student success coaches in each faculty at the university. And what the lecturer then does is monitor the performance of students, particularly after the first test or the first assessment, and then identifies students who are vulnerable, and then advises those students to make use of the student success. So it's not student counseling, that's in addition to student success advising. This is actually someone based in the faculty who will then work with that student and identify their barrier and then help them to navigate that barrier so that in subsequent assessments, they can do much better. So, that's why I was saying earlier that there's a variety of support measures in place to assist students. But the challenge is for the lecturer to take responsibility, but also for the student to take responsibility, to work in a collaborative way to ensure that the best potential of every student is realized.
Thank you very much. And Tato, maybe you can come in there as inferred from Professor Neal. What more can we do? I mean, we sometimes we round around in circles, and we probably will be having even more leading discussions in the near future about this. But what more can we do than what we've already done? Maybe Tato, you can come in there, and then I'll have Susan, and then we'll have our closing remarks in that regard. Tato?
We haven't really done much. We've barely scratched the surface.
Sure.
We've literally began to realistically identify some of the challenges that we've all been speaking about. But one of the things that we have not been is we have not been honest. You spoke about a system that is honest, that is able to look at its society and say, this is where we as a society need to move to or want to move to economically, socially, you name it. Yeah. And then begin to plan 5, 10, 15 years in bunches and saying, these are the milestones we want to hit. We have not done that. Tabang, we may be having this conversation again next year around this time. And,
we will.
And there will be very little that would have changed in the corridors where that change needs to happen. Professor Neal, Mr. Davies, Susan, the PK, they will all be working to try and solve in piecemeal attempts what is systematic in nature. So for me, I think that is where I see is the biggest challenge. So what more we should be doing? We should be more honest. We should really be looking at the system properly. And I agree with Mr. PK in that we also had an opportunity to try and run a pilot at Orbit College in the Northwest, and a very successful pilot. But at the end of the pilot, we were told by the funder we were not going to repeat the program, even though financially, academically, and otherwise, the program was highly successful. So we are not working within a very honest system, and we are not honestly looking at where the country needs to move, not only in terms of skill development, but in terms of our education system and how we can best take advantage of great minds, great institutions, a very willing society, a very willing young people and old people to learn, and how best to take advantage of that. Thanks.
Sure, thank you very much. Susan, maybe you can come in there. I've also observed, not only just in research and so forth, that the suicide rates that are increasing are actually amongst young people and amongst students in universities in tertiary education. How do you think we can manage that? And I mean, we spoke earlier on about, psychosocial challenges and so forth, but from an aspect of mental health and mental support, what do you think universities can offer?
Okay, thank you, Thabang. But I think before I even answer the question, I'd like to add on what Ntato has already spoken about with regards to what more can we do. I believe that we also need to start early. I feel like the conversation around access and success has been going on for a while now, but I still feel like we're still trying to address it from a tertiary level. So I think it's time we start early from high school. I think today Russell has already spoken about things like career choices, psychometric tests. I feel like those are things that we need to start very earlier on. And I think another thing that I can add on is things like exposure, right? Especially speaking about culture. Students or learners need to be exposed to the world that they'll be dealing with when they get to university at a very early age. Things like practically it would look like camps, making sure that we have career visits. Let's visit certain companies on certain days so that they see what the outside world or the world they're getting into looks like, so that by the time they get to it, there isn't really that cultural shock because they're already aware of what they're heading towards. So that's one thing that I can add. And then when it comes to mental health, I think that is a very difficult one, not just for our students, but I think for everyone in the world right now. And in the past few weeks, we've been running workshops with our students, what we call orientation workshops. And the topic was on self-actualization. But one of the things that we also realized was that we cannot keep on going on while ignoring this dark cloud that we have around us with regards to mental health. So I think the best way to address it is, number one, it has to do with access. As much as slowly we are getting aware of the mental health challenges that a lot of people are facing in the country or in the world, I still feel like there isn't really access. Especially for people from a certain background, right? You still don't know where you need to go to get assistance when it comes to mental health. And I will say that institutions have really tried as well on their side to make sure that there are psychologists on campuses, there are psychologists within different departments, but they do not have capacity. And that's one of the things that we struggle with the most. Most of our students will identify that they're struggling psychosocially, and then there's a waiting list for a whole month that they need to wait. By the time they get to see a psychologist, time has already gone. A lot could have happened. In that month, they need assistance right away. So what we've tried to do as an organization is just encouraging most of our funders to look at funding for psychosocial assistance. Obviously, it's going to require an extra money to do it. I think right now, an average is around 850. So it's all about promoting access, making sure that we're talking about it, normalizing it as well. We all know that the stigma, I think we spoke about it in the beginning of the session, that the stigma around mental health issues, we think, okay, I'm struggling, but I can't go and speak up about it because there's certain stigma associated with it. So I think one of the things that we need to do is destigmatize it, but also there's a lot of work that needs to be done with regards to access to mental health assistance. We still need
fantastic. Thank you so much. In this particular order, may I request your closing remarks? And of course, if you needed to say something, you can include it in there. Professor Neal, you will go first, and then we will have Melody Clava. After Melody, we will have Mr. Pique, and then we will have Susan, and Tato, and Russell. Okay.
Great.
Hopefully
Thanks so much,
remember
Thabang.
the order. Go ahead, then.
Thanks so much, Thabang. So just in closing, I think what this panel discussion has brought home to me yet again is the importance of an integrated and joined up system that supports students to access post-school studies and also to succeed. I mean, just on this panel alone, there's initiatives that I wasn't even aware of. So if
Absolutely.
I am not aware of it as a person in the university sector, how are students in deep rural areas going to be aware of all the support that's out there for them? So I think what's needed is for the different sectors of society that are interested in student access for success to come together and to really design and implement joined up strategies that will really just identify which students are most at risk in terms of not accessing further studies, and also those students who, when they access further studies, are most vulnerable in terms of the likelihood of not succeeding due to various issues, often not academic, often relating to, you know, their sense of identity, adapting
Yes.
to post-school studies, and also just coping with the demands of post-school studies in the current circumstances, especially. You know, we as a university have implemented what we call multiple learning pathways, where we go beyond just online learning, where you know, we combine different methodologies to make sure that the digital divide is not a factor impacting on student success. So there's just a need for us to really just, as institutions, be integrated in our approaches, but also as a society to be joined up in our approaches. And parity of esteem between the different sectors in the post-school landscape is really critical too. We need, you know, societal messaging around going to a TVET college, going to a private institution, going to a public university. There needs to be parity of esteem amongst the different parts of the post-school sector, so that young people can make informed decisions about where best they need to pursue their careers and their hopes and dreams. Thanks, Tabang.
Thank you so much. That was Professor Heather Neal, Senior Director at Institutional Strategy at the Nelson Mandela University. Thank you very much for that. Melody? Ms. Clava?
Yes. So in my closing remarks, I just, you know, I want us to, I know we've got all these challenges and these issues that, you know, we are facing, and we won't be able, you know, to solve them overnight. And we are making, you know, all these, you know, different efforts that we are putting into it. But I also want us to look at the good things that we've got, you know, going on.
Yes.
We are raising a different generation of children right now. And for example, with me, I'm a millennial. Still very much in touch, you know, with what's happening, you know, with Gen Z. And one of the things that social media, as much as there's a lot of negative with social media, but one of the positive things that social media has been able to give to us is just bringing issues forward that previously we did not know how to talk about. Right? As much as we are looking at the fact that there's a huge rise, you know, in depression and anxiety and suicide rates, there's also a huge rise in terms of the conversation and people speaking up and saying, I am struggling. There's not enough people speaking up, right? And maybe might not even be the platform, but we are becoming a more open society in terms of just expressing, you know, how we feel about stuff. And I feel that part of the efforts when it comes to how do we offer support now to, you know, students when it comes to transitioning, you know, to university is getting their peers included and involved in this, right? We are raising children who are a lot more compassionate than what our parents used to be. And for different reasons, you know, our parents were living in apartheid, they were afraid of each other because of the different races and the different cultures. That's less and less now, more, you know, it's much less problem than it was, you know, before. I remember with me at varsity, with the struggles that I had in first year, by the time I got to third year, some of my biggest support came from my peers, not because of what the school said they should do, but because as rich as they were, when some of them realized this struggles that I was going through, their first instinct was compassion. It wasn't, oh, well, I'm rich, this is, you know, not my problem, I don't need to give you a lift, you know, to go to that place. And I think that in our interventions, we have to include the kids. We have to make them part of the solution. In our essence as people, we are good, right? In our essence, really just all of us, we are good. And most of these kids, when they do realize that there's a problem like this that's happening to my peer, their first instinct is compassion and wanting to help. And I just wanted to put that out there to say, instead of just even isolating the solutions and saying the solution here is just educating and giving information to only the students who are struggling. Tell everybody that there are students in here who are struggling, and see how many of them put up their hand and say, I had no idea that you don't know how to use this device. Actually, I'm going to help you for the next couple of weeks to be able to adjust. Peer-to-peer learning is one of the most powerful tools, one of the most powerful tools that I don't feel that, we are using enough, because we are just afraid that, oh, the rich kid doesn't want to help the poor kid. That's not the case with Gen Z. If you don't take my word for it, go on TikTok and just see the cultural diversity that, is happening, in that space. It's a different generation of children that we are raising now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Melody Clava, co-founder and chief creative director at My Future Work. May I please then ask Mr. Pike?
So first of all, thank you very much for having me on this discussion. It is highly appreciated. I think my small contribution in terms of closing, it's perhaps to get government to realign its funding strategy, to get money where it should go, but then also the issues around advocacy. My college currently has partnerships with Germany, China, and Japan, companies, and absolutely nothing in South Africa. The issue that is raised earlier on, we are reaching out to international partnerships in space, and the South African companies don't seem to know what we're offering, and then that's where the issue around major advocacy is coming in. But the TVET space is heavily legislated to an extent that you are focusing on compliance issues rather than rendering a service as a public institution to the students or the intended audience. And I think many institutions are then held hamstrung on really just dealing with compliance issues and are not able to then render the services that they should. But I think we need to then deal with that. But then it will lead me to the next point that will say the acceptance of students on merit and relevant qualifications or programs should then be the name of our operations. So, but by and large, for me, is the issues around legislation and the issue around funding, and also let funding go where it should go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was Mr. PK, Accounting and Executive Officer and Principal in College Sector. Truly appreciated. Can we have Suzanne?
Thank you so much, everyone, for the amazing discussion that we had today. So I think what I just want to say in closing is that we have discussed quite a lot. We spoke about the barriers that the students are facing with transition from high school to tertiary studies. But one thing that I want us to acknowledge as well is the resilience that the students show as well, right? And I also just want to add that as hectic or as difficult the transition is, I also feel like it is necessary. I still go back today, every single time I go back to UCT, I always say, oh my God, I'm very grateful for this institution because it has made me the person that I am today. So, and how I look at it is that you step into the university or you enter as a very young woman or young person, and obviously you need to go through different stages. And I use the concept, you need to be cooked and you need to make sure that you're fully cooked by the time you leave. And part of that is facing the difficulties, right? Mm-hmm. And being here today together is also just realizing, making me realize that as difficult as it is, there are so many organizations doing the best that they can with different interventions to assist the students. And one thing that we've also realized as well at Study Trust is that our students also have the resilience to go through it. So that's one thing that I just wanted to acknowledge before we leave today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. That was Ms. Suzanne Ramzuli, Mentoring and Student Support Manager at Study Trust. And without further ado, can we please have Mr. Nkato Silebi?
Thanks, Sawang. And I think I'd like to echo what colleagues have already said as well. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be engaging and discussing an area that is very, very important to our education. I didn't fully introduced myself at the beginning of the program intentionally, because I think, as Melody has said and as Susan has said, one of the things that I believe that we're not doing enough of is telling enough about our success stories, and about the fact that this is very possible. As a young person, having to navigate high school education in America and university education in America, and be able to come through with all the challenges, and that transition brought, not only in terms of moving from one level of study to another, but also culturally, societally, you name it. I used to joke with my friends that I had to acquire a new sense of humor, because South African humor is very different from American humor. But the fact that I was able to traverse that and come out on the other side, for me, is something that we are not, telling enough of, so as to be able to create the kind of role models that will start earlier, Susan, at schools, that will drop down into communities and be able to say, this is very possible. We just need to shift our eye at what we are focusing on. So I think for me, that just the parting shot is that we need to be speaking a lot more of the Susans and the Melodies of this country. We need to be speaking a lot more of so many more that make it, versus the ones that don't make it. And for corporates to understand, and for institutions to understand, some of us may take a little longer, but we're going to get it. And all we need is just for your patience and understanding, and support. So these conversations are very important for me. And I think we need to continuously have them. But also we need to, as I said, speak more of the success stories, because those create a culture, those create aspirations that others can aspire to. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was the project director at National Projects for Psych, Mr. Nthato Silibi. Thank you very much for your inputs there. Mr. Russell Davies?
Thanks, Tabang. I think for me, the very thorny and unanswerable question is about scale and how you offer this support, to the masses. I think as a couple of our institutional colleagues, Heather and Brian have indicated, you have a services offered at the institution, but thousands of students, and how do you ever sort of cater to that sort of load? And those services are by nature always going to be reactive and relying on the student to access them, or it's sort of responding to something that happens. It's much more difficult to make them proactive. And at REAP, we work very much on like an accompaniment model where we're traveling with the students throughout, and we can try and intervene early when there's an issue, and that's based on the relationship of trust that we've developed over time. But these kind of support services, wraparound support is often a term that's used, are expensive and and quite intensive. I know the psycho model is probably the 5-star model, and there's others of us maybe offering a 3-star model. It's a little bit cheaper, and maybe the study trust career-wise, relying more on peers. It's a bit cheaper again, but still to scale that with the kind of numbers we're talking about, I don't know how we ever find the resources or the human capacity to do that. So you're left with, institutions offering a range of services, but relying on the students to access them. And a lot of our work is trying to keep our students alive to the opportunities and the services that do exist, and encouraging them to use them, but without that, many of them won't do it. And as has been shared, it's often not culturally what the average student is going to do. They're not used to talking to, psychologists, particularly maybe, elderly, white, postgraduate trained professionals. It's not the people they're going to share their stuff with. So how do we provide the sort of support that's necessary, still promote agency, but do it to scale? I think that's very challenging. So I don't have the answer to that. And the organizations like ourselves and Study Trust, we work with a number of people, but in terms of the overall student population, it's a drop in the ocean, if you like. So, and do you offer, as I say, with Psycho, the 5-star service to the few, or do you offer the 1-star service to the many, or what's the answer? So I don't have an answer to that. So I think it's something we have to keep wrestling with.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Davies. That was Mr. D, Director of Rural Educational Access Program. We don't have the answers, but probably in the next conference next year, we'll have the answer. Keep us accountable and hold us to it. And thank you so much for brushing our egos. And Tato's even smiling there. The first time we see that smile, saying Psycha is a 5-star here. Hey, Mr. Davies, don't get us in trouble. Thank you so much, everyone. This was truly insightful. We appreciate your time. And I truly hope that you've given a lot of companies, organizations, just action items to truly pursue in the nearer future, so that by the time we come back next year, the conversation is completely different. Thank you very much, and all the best in your future endeavors.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was our last panel discussion for the day, transitioning from secondary school to tertiary education. Thank you very, very much that you have still been with us. Just lastly, we are busy tailing all the expo visits. So today's prizes, please be notified that they will be announced first thing tomorrow morning. We also encourage you to participate in overnight visits, check the expos, send your comments still in the evening after work when you get home. And this is also permanently active even after the event. So please feel free to visit us. Don't forget to send your recommendations and of course your questions on #SkillSummit22. Well done for making it through day one. And we do thank FP&M Seta for being our key sponsor and partner for this event. Until tomorrow, same time, same place on your screens. And I will catch you at the same time, as I mentioned. Take good care and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Signing out.